Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 25 minutes before 11 o'clock. Robin, we are children of the 50s.
Yes, we are.
Which means we were born probably at the perfect time so that we didn't have to worry about things like German measles, chicken pox, polio. I know some people who were born in our era did have to go through some of these things. I think I might have had chicken pox, actually.
Oh, I did.
But the point is, vaccines were developed by amazingly intelligent people. We remember the names of rock stars and rock and roll stars, right? But we don't usually remember the names of those people who have saved hundreds of millions of lives, is what I wanted to say there. And you think it's over, right? We figured it out. We stopped all the diseases in the world, and now we can move on, right? I don't think so. I was looking at the information provided for our next book, and it makes me realize that it's a never-ending battle or never-ending challenge for those scientists and doctors who work on these kinds of things. And what's so crazy in this world is that sometimes political barriers are a part of the problem. So let's find out about this. Meredith Wadman is on the phone. She wrote the book called The Vaccine Race. She is a reporter for Science Magazine. She's a contributor to Nature, The Washington Post, and New York Times. It goes on and on and on. Wall Street Journal. She is a Rhodes Scholar. How many people can actually say that? She worked on the pediatric ward in an underfunded hospital for blacks in apartheid era of South Africa. I think you knew what I was going to say there anyway. She traveled in longboats to work in public health clinics in the jungles of Borneo. So she knows the importance of the thing we take for granted here in America, the vaccines. And let's find out about this, the vaccine race. Science, politics. How does politics even fit into this? But I'm sure it does. Good morning, Meredith. How are you?
Good morning, Larry. I'm fine. How are you?
Good. And I am probably good because I remember getting a sugar cube.
Yeah, no kidding.
Me too, for polio.
Yeah. So tell me about this. Did I get anything wrong in the intro, first of all?
No, nothing at all. Except, well, I guess if you are a child of the 50s, depending on when in the 50s, it's not a slam dunk that you were vaccinated in childhood against, several what are now almost unheard of viral diseases like measles, like mumps, like rubella. Those vaccines really didn't come online until the 60s, by and large, with the exception of polio, which was 1955.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I was born in 55. So there I don't remember 55. I think my memory only starts around 60. So or maybe 59. I don't know. But I mean, wouldn't I have gotten the vaccine after the fact, after I was 5 or 6 years old?
Sure, but one thing to remember is that some of the kids that are most endangered by these diseases, if they're not vaccinated today or their older sibs are not, or back in the day, are infants. You are protected as a baby by maternal antibodies that your mom passes over to you at birth and in breast milk. But beginning about 6 months old, those antibodies wane, and there's this really vulnerable age, sort of the second half of the first year of life, when kids are just really at risk. Really?
And does the statement I made about the fact that we still need to be looking for vaccines, is that true? I mean, do we have things happening right now that we need to continue tackling?
Oh, absolutely. You may have noticed there was another Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the last several weeks. We've had Zika, although that has tailed off. But when it comes again, and it will, again, babies are affected in the womb by Zika virus, and they're born with these tiny shrunken heads and lots of other problems that are related to brain damage. So those are just a couple examples, and not to mention HIV, for which we still don't have a vaccine, of vaccines that are still really badly needed in this day and age.
And are you one of the people responsible for doing research on the vaccines themselves?
Oh, no, I'm a writer. I went through medical school, and then I almost immediately went to journalism school. So I'm kind of a hybrid, but I'm not someone who's ever worn a white coat and worked at a lab bench. I just love learning, and I loved learning about the history of vaccines that came on board in the 60s as I wrote The Vaccine Race. And, one of the things, sorry, did you want to interject?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Just one of the really amazing discoveries I felt in the book that was new to me was just how dangerous German measles, which is a milder form than classical measles, it's caused by a different virus, was in the 60s for unborn babies. In fact, there was this, what rubella virus does is this tiny virus, it's like, microscopic, not even. And if a pregnant woman was exposed before the vaccine came online in 1969, and especially if she was exposed in the first trimester, her baby was likely to be born with blindness, profound deafness, a malformed heart, problems with intelligence often, and numerous other difficulties. And in 1964, there was a huge German measles epidemic. And in 64-65, there were more than 20,000 American babies born with some combination of these disabilities. So we take it for granted today. I mean, German measles is a thing of the past, but it was no joke if you were a pregnant woman in the 60s. And not only that, you didn't even know if you were exposed, because German measles is often so mild that you can't tell you have it. Your kids go to school with it, and kids are exposed, and then they bring it home to mom who's pregnant. So it was a really scary time. It landed on the cover of Life magazine. It was that scary for childbearing women in those years.
Meredith, I was wondering if you could help us understand what your research revealed to you regarding the roadblocks that politics may have placed, so the scientists maybe couldn't do what they needed to do. And if I could ask you to extend it to beyond the borders of this country, I'm guessing that within the borders, there was a certain set of challenges, political challenges. And I'm guessing outside in the rest of the world, there must have been some as well. So,
right. Well, in the book, it's really ironic, but the Europeans were actually very forward-looking in terms of allowing vaccines to be developed with a particular group of cells. And I've got to answer your question, I have to start with a woman I called Mrs. X in the book. She lived in Sweden in the early 60s. She had several small children. Her husband was basically a no-goodnik. He was out of town. He was drunk. He had a criminal record. He was no help around the house. And when she discovered early in 1962 that she was pregnant yet again, she decided she could not go through with the pregnancy. Now, in Sweden in that era, abortion was legal but not easy to get. Most doctors would not perform abortions. And by the time Mrs. X found a sympathetic female gynecologist, a rare breed in Sweden in those days, she was 4 months pregnant. And once that abortion took place, the aborted fetus was taken without Mrs. X's knowledge or consent, shuffled off to the very famous Karolinska Institute. Its lungs were dissected out. They were packed on wet ice and flown to Philadelphia, where at a kind of hoary old research institute named the Wistar Institute, a young, ambitious, highly capable scientist named Leonard Hayflick was waiting for those cells. Why did he want them? To get the cells from the lungs. Why did he want them? Because he was going to use those cells as miniature vaccine factories to make safe, clean viral vaccines. Because to make a viral vaccine, you have to grow the virus in cells. And you grow it in cells as it grows in cells in the lab, it becomes less good at causing disease in humans. You want a viral vaccine that provokes the immune system when injected, but does not actually cause the disease. So here was Leonard Hayflick using these cells from Mrs. X's fetus to make actually available to many vaccine makers and other scientists in the 60s who took them and used them as miniature factories. And that is how the vaccine primarily, the most important vaccine made in these cells was the German measles vaccine that put an end in the year 2000 or 2005 rather to rubella to German measles in this country. Now, why were there political problems? Because regulators, and there was one man at the National Institutes of Health who was the gatekeeper of the U.S. vaccine market, a guy named Rod Murray. He was a stiff upper lip, didn't take any advice from anyone, was very silent about his thinking process, and he did not like those cells, Len Hayflick cells. It's not known quite why, but it's probable that he thought they might be cancer causing. In the end, they have proved out as safe, clean, and are used to this day to make the German measles vaccine that your kids and mine have received.
Wow. That is a fascinating story.
But Rod Murray stood in the way of approval of any vaccines made in these cells for 10 years until finally he was deposed after a Senate inquiry.
So but I'm just a little bit confused here. So he was opposed to it because he thought they would be cancerous?
Yeah, he was not opposed to them for pro-life reasons, although there was opposition from people who were adamantly opposed to abortion that emerged in the 70s and continues among a fraction of ardent opponents of abortion today who object to having their children take the rubella. Rubella is another name for German measles, the German measles vaccine, because it is made in these cells. And they even wrote to the Pope and the Vatican at the turn of this century and said, please, will you tell us, can good Catholics take this vaccine? And the Pope sent it away to their best moral philosophers at the Vatican. And they came back a couple years later and said, the evil inherent in that one abortion that happened in 1962 is outweighed by the evil involved in not vaccinating your kids and then risking community health because they're not vaccinated.
So the question I have is, I'm assuming that we don't still create the vaccine that same way.
Believe it or not, we do. It's kind of a case of if it ain't broken, don't fix it. They have a very specific process that has produced a very safe, highly effective vaccine for, going on 40 years now.
Really?
So, yes. Yeah.
So aborted fetuses are used to this day in order to create...
No.
Okay.
No, the cells from this one legally aborted fetus.
Oh my gosh!
In Sweden in 1952.
And so are they? Is it a finite resource? Could they eventually run out?
Isn't that a great question? That's the first question I had. Because of the power of exponential growth, these cells divide over and over. And because also, if you take a vial of these cells and freeze them in 1962, as Leonard Hayflick did, he made 800 vials of these cells in 1962. Each one was roughly 3 million cells in it. Well, if you do the math, you will discover that for practical purposes, the source of cells he created was infinite. And that's because if you freeze them and then thaw them, whether you thaw them a year later or 10 years later or 50 years later, the cells will begin dividing again as if nothing had ever happened.
Wow, that is pretty fascinating, isn't it?
Wow.
So talk to us about some of the other vaccines. Are they all developed in a similar way?
No, there are quite a number that were developed in this particular cell line and in a cell line that the British developed, a cell line meaning a group of self-replicating cells. The British in 1966, from one other legal abortion, developed a comparable group of cells, and between Mrs. X's fetus's cells and the British group, there are vaccines made against polio, rabies, chickenpox, measles, hepatitis A, shingles, and a lesser-known virus called adenovirus that was a real problem in military barracks back in the day. So, yes, lots of vaccines are made using these cells, but today, going forward, they're not using these cells. They have more sophisticated methods for making new vaccines.
Now, on a more local level, and I don't mean local here in Florida, but I mean just like localized everywhere you look, there's a local little story like this. There are some parents who, for one reason or another, don't want their children to have vaccines, and it always makes the news. I know this local school board here, you have to have the vaccines, otherwise you've got to do homeschooling or something, but you can't be part of the school body. Is that a big issue, or is it a very, I'm imagining it's not, but that's kind of why I'm asking, or do we have a big problem with that?
I wouldn't say it's a big problem. There was a Pew Research Center poll done, about 18 months ago, or maybe it was 2 years, where, a large sample of surveyed adults said they supported, childhood vaccination. They were asked about the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine specifically, but I think that was a fair proxy for the other childhood vaccines. And, nearly 90% had no issues. Now, it's worth noting that for really contagious diseases, measles being the primary one, public health experts want 95% of kids vaccinated. If you start to fall below that, you get an endangered community where unvaccinated kids can spread to other unvaccinated kids, and worse yet, to their younger baby sisters and brothers that I talked about at the beginning, who are still not vaccinated, because kids aren't vaccinated until a year old for measles, mumps, and rubella.
Can they split that vaccine to give them 3 separate shots over 3 different periods of time, or do they all have to be at that one time?
That's an excellent question. The Vaccine Advisory Board, that is made up of experts that basically recommend how vaccination should be given in childhood in the States, they concluded that because you're asking parents to come back, maybe a dozen times if you're going to give these kids all these vaccines separately, they recommended that it's really best to be given in one so-called MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, which is given once in infancy and once just before kindergarten. That's, the take-home message. Now, I should add that abortion opponents have agitated for production of the rubella / the German measles element, which is the R in MMR, have agitated to have a separate vaccine so that they could still avoid that one and get their kids vaccinated against measles and mumps. But Merck, the company that makes the MMR vaccine, has just concluded that that's just a non-starter, and they have basically refused to make a separate German measles vaccine.
Meredith, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the MMR connection, or the suggested connection, to autism. We've had a couple of guests who believe there is a connection, and I do a radio show, so I don't really know one. I don't know. I'm wondering what you discovered.
Oh, I'm really disturbed that this fully discredited myth continues to circulate. It's very troubling. A now discredited British doctor who lost his license and can no longer practice, who has since relocated to Texas, by the way, named Andrew Wakefield, published a now retracted, discredited paper in 1998 in the Lancet, the medical journal, that since withdrew the paper, and it suggested that yes, this MMR vaccine could cause autism. Well, that's just simply not the fact, and this has been investigated to death, including by the U.S. Institutes of Medicine. Our best medical minds concluded early this century that there is no link. I don't know how more plainly to put it than that, but it really is disturbing, because it puts kids at risk. Not vaccinating against MMR puts kids at risk of extremely serious diseases. I mean, when I was in South Africa in the apartheid era, I watched these 2-year-olds die when measles invaded their brain for lack of a 25-cent vaccine. It's just wrong.
The book is called The Vaccine Race. It's written by our guest, Meredith Wadman. And Meredith, tell us some of the things that are in the book regarding the human cost. That's part of the subtitles: Science, Politics, and the Human Cost of Defeating Disease. When you say cost, I'm assuming it's not dollars and cents, or is it?
You know what? It's a nod to the now unethical, and then unethical, but now no longer carried out practices that U.S. researchers did in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s on innocent, powerless populations of usually children in orphanages, in poverty wards, in charity hospitals, in what were then called mental asylums for intellectually disabled kids. They would use these powerless groups of children to test new vaccines in an era in which that was accepted. It is simply no longer accepted, but that's what the human costs refers to
Really?
in the subtitle of the book.
So,
yeah.
So they would give a vaccine and then expose the child to the disease and to see if it would work?
They would not expose the child to the disease. They did not go that far, but take a hospital that no longer exists called Philadelphia General Hospital. It was totally the go-to hospital for pregnant moms who were African American in Philadelphia back in the 50s. Everyone, trusted staff there. They went there, they had their babies, and the babies were, in the infant nursery on the ward at Philadelphia General Hospital, and across the street was the Wistar Institute, where they were developing these vaccines, one against polio, and there was a connection between the medical researchers at the Research Institute and the hospital threw open its doors and said, by all means, come in and vaccinate these newborn African-American kids, was not so much as a buy your leave to the parents.
Oh my.
And so if the vaccine had been dangerous, and it wasn't, it turned out, thank God, but had it been, those kids were just basically guinea pigs. And that happened. That was not unique to Philadelphia. And it happened all over this country. And it began in the 40s because that was the war years, and all the stops were pulled out to do medical experiments to try to protect soldiers at the front because civilization was at stake. But the mentality continued for 20 years after, until the mid-60s, when finally the government began to make changes that required informed consent from people who were in medical studies and so on.
We like to think, and I hope that this is right, that when we have positive discoveries like what you're talking about in this country, that it's not only for this country, that the whole world benefits, that the children in South Africa, the children in North Korea, other countries that may be hard to get the information through to. Is that happening? I want to believe it is, that we make a discovery and it helps everybody, not just those children in this country.
It absolutely does happen. I mean, the German measles vaccine that was developed in the cells from Mrs. X's fetus, that was licensed in this country in 1979 finally, and has wiped out rubella in the Western Hemisphere, German measles in the Western Hemisphere, is used all over the world today. Now, it needs to be said that in poor countries, there's still loads of kids that are not vaccinated. And there are, it's thought, 100,000 children born blind, deaf, intellectually disabled, and with heart defects globally every year because their mothers were exposed to German measles while they were pregnant and not vaccinated.
You have put a lot of work into this book. I would like to share the book with one listener. The book was sent to me. I'd like to give it away. Call me if you want the Vaccine Race book. The number here is 622-9622. It's the only one I have, so I can only give one away. The rest of us have to go buy it. I did find it on Amazon. Let me look and see real quickly. And do you have a website you want to recommend in addition? The cover on Amazon is different than this cover, though, but you're getting really good reviews. And it looks like, let me see if it's got a number on here. It's doing very well. In forensic medicine, it's number 66 out of millions of books. That's pretty good.
Congratulations.
Do you have a website you want to recommend?
Yeah, it's meredithwadman.com. Just my name, meredithwadman.com. I should add that the book was out. It was newly published in paperback on Tuesday. So if you want to save a few pennies, you can now get the paperback version.
Oh, okay. And that must be the version that was sent to me.
Yes, likely so.
The Vaccine Race. Okay. Meredith, thank you for your work. I think you're helping us understand something that we kind of take for granted. We kind of just live our lives and we think that, this is there. You don't realize all the work and the challenges behind that work. It's just amazing. We have some amazingly smart people out there, and then we have politicians who stand in the way.
Yeah, for sure.
Meredith, thank you for what you're doing.
You're so welcome, and thanks for having me on, Larry. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. We will be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio, I'm Chris Foster. Democrats at Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court Senate confirmation hearing want to release documents over Republican objections that have been